So now it's time to get into English itself. And we're going to begin with Old English. There are three periods of the English language. We call them Old English, Middle English, and Modern English. And one thing you should remember, of course, as we're talking about these things, is that language change, even when it's fast, is from our perspective pretty gradual. So it isn't like one day English didn't exist and the next day it suddenly existed, or one day they were speaking Old English, the next day they were suddenly speaking Middle English. Rather, it's a kind of gradual process. And you should think a little bit about these sort of beginning dates and ending dates, a little bit like, say, your 18th birthday, when we would say, well, now you're legally an adult on your 18th birthday, but in point of fact, we know that coming to maturity, some of that comes before that, some of that comes after that, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some symbolism to these dates. Now, in order to sort of think about where English comes from as a language, we have to begin centuries before, during the Roman Empire. And during the time of the Roman Empire, the island we now consider England, or Britain, was occupied by the Britons. And if you'll look on your Indo-European language tree, you'll see that they spoke a Celtic language, Brittonic. And so the Britons, they were conquered by the Romans, and over the next 4 centuries, they became Romanized. They accepted their role as part of the Roman Empire and also became Christianized, and that's going to become important as well. Well, when the Roman Empire begins to collapse, the Britons are having trouble with the people to the north, where we consider Scotland today. And so, according to Bede, they invite in mercenaries, these figures, Hengsts and Horsa, from the Anglo-Saxons. And we know that before this time there were already settlements of the Anglo-Saxons there, but this is sort of the symbolic date of when they first come over. And what happens is, although the Anglo-Saxons theoretically are coming over to defend the Britons, according to the story, after just a couple of years, conflict breaks out between them and they turn on them. And this begins really a century and a half of warfare between the people who we would now call the English or the Anglo-Saxons and the people who were the Britons, who eventually become the modern Welsh in Wales and Cornwall, which is why there with those other languages on the Celtic tree where the Britons are, you'll see Cornish and Welsh. Now, when we see this happen, why does English start when the Anglo-Saxons come over? What were they speaking before? Well, in fact, they were speaking a Germanic language just like they had before. But what happens is now they are on the island, and the English Channel is separating them from their family and friends in what we might consider Germany today. And so because of that, over the generations, as their languages drift, they drift off in different directions. So for some generations, they could still communicate very well with one another and considered themselves to speak the same language, but the drift had begun. And so that's the moment at which that drift begins. Well, you'll see that at 597, an important thing happens, and that is St. Augustus of Canterbury arrives in England and begins converting the English, starting with King Ethelbert of Kent. And the reason that this is important is that even though the Britons were Christian, the Anglo-Saxons were not Christian. They worship what we consider the Norse pantheon of gods, like Odin and Thor and those guys. Well, when they begin to convert to Christianity, this begins the influx from the church of Latin, of Latin phrases and Latin words that come into the language. And so that is, of course, from a different language family. That's from the Italic or Romance language family. And so those start coming into the language at that point. And so this is why when we see in the history all this talk about church history, you might think, what does any of this have to do with the language? This is what it has to do with the language. It connects the church in England to the church of the continent. So, of course, when you look at the Synod of Whitby, for example, this is where they essentially say, you know what, we're not going to follow the way the church in Ireland is going. We're instead going to follow the church in Rome. In essence, saying we're going to take on the more Romance language, Italic influence, not the Celtic influence. Now, another thing you'll see in the key historical events here that's important are the Scandinavian invasions, the invasions by people that we call Vikings. And these are important because over time, the Vikings take almost all of England in something we call the Danelaw. And the Danelaw, they took every kingdom except for Wessex, where King Alfred the Great defended them. But they had an influence again on the Anglo-Saxons, but they spoke already a very similar language. Right? They spoke another Germanic language, very closely related. Interestingly enough, the Britons who came before also had close cultural contact with the Anglo-Saxons, but for some reason we don't have a lot of their words entering into the language. Most of what we have from them are place names. And as you look through these different the different dates here in the history, I'm not going to go through all of them now, you'll see how there is more and more of a connection with the church in England and the church in Rome at this time. We're going to see that, so we're going to reverse later on. And because of this, we're going to see this sort of influx of language. Now, what happens at the end, and they give you a little history of this here in your book, what happens in the end is when Edward the Confessor dies, there isn't a clear heir. There are three potential heirs to the throne. Without going into all the details that are in your book, William the Conqueror is the one who eventually does take that role, and he speaks Norman French, that is an Italic or Romance language. And so ending the Old English period is a time when they're being dominated by people who not only don't speak English, but speak a language from a different language family. Arguably, of course, this was true under the Danelaw, which controlled most of England. However, they spoke a very similar language. And so an example of this might be if you've read Beowulf, you might notice that Beowulf travels to Denmark, modern Denmark, and he talks to them just like they can understand one another. And we have good reason to think that that was pretty much the case. They might have thought they had weird accents or they used some weird vocabulary, but they could understand one another when they spoke. Also, it's important to note that although there are 7 kingdoms in the Old English heptarchy, as we say, there really are just 4 basic dialects: Northumbrian, Mercian, West Saxon, and Kentish. And of those, Mercian is the one which sort of carries forward ultimately to modern English. West Saxon is not. However, West Saxon, because of King Alfred the Great, most of the Old English texts that survive to the modern era are West Saxon texts. Now, as you're looking through this, one other thing I wanted to point out to you that happens at this time is there are some differences in the writing of the language. There is this thing that looks like an A and an E together, which we've talked about before, that's called an ash. That's part of the Old English orthography. There are 2 consonant clusters which are difficult for modern English speakers. The SC is pronounced sh in Old English, and the CG is pronounced j in Old English. Okay, so those 2 are a little bit difficult. And I think important to note too, in the way that the language is written, is the eth. They have these 2 letters. One is called a thorn and one is called an eth. And the thorn and the eth are 2 ways of doing the th sound. Now, this can be confusing to modern English learners who are trying to do IPA, because by this time you should know that just because it's written that way in modern English doesn't mean it's pronounced that way in IPA in modern English. Well, this is true also for the eth. The eth doesn't necessarily mean it was voiced or unvoiced. In fact, they use the eth and the thorn interchangeably in their writing. And so when you look then at the readings, keep that in mind. It's very confusing when you see an eth, you want to assume that it's an eth. Now, I want you to look for a moment at the consonant chart that you're going to have to learn. And one important distinction I'd like you to see there is that fricatives in Old English were not divided into voiced and voiceless. So the Old English speakers did not distinguish between the voiced and the voiceless sounds. So to an Old English speaker, a s and z or a f and v would essentially be the same sound in terms of the meaning of that sound. I want to do a little bit of reading for you from Old English because I know that you're going to need a sample of this. So I'm just going to read for you the Good Samaritan excerpt here. Som man färde fram Jerusalem till Jericho and bekom unta chefen, tha hine berevadon, an tintregodon hine, an forletan hine sam kukene. Tha jevirda hit that sum satcherd färle on them ilkan wer, an tha he that jesea he hine forbear. And el swa se diakon, tha he was with the stoa, and that Jesea he hine forbear. The verde sum Samaritanishman with hine, the hine Jesea, the worth he made mild heartedness over hine esteered. I love that word, mild heartedness or mild heartedness for compassion. The jener lertahe and wrath his wounda on and on Ayat, Ela and Wien, and hine on his Nutaseta, and Yelada on his Lechahus, and hine Lachnod, and brought Othram there, Twenas Penias, and Zelda Tham Lacha, and Thusquath, Begumhus, and Swa Thumara to Yedes, Thona each kuma, each hit for Gulda, there, whilst thou affair of Funst, there that see thus me, there on the share the bearful. Okay, now, I read that to you because I wanted you to hear among just the general sound, but I also want you to notice that this sound, which is represented, it looks like a Y with a kind of umlaut over it. This is pronounced U. And so you sort of make the U, the I sound, I, but you round your lips to I. And so that would be how you would pronounce that sound.